Our little project here is very troubled. Let's go ahead and take this thing apart. If you haven't seen it before, this is the magic tool we use to get the oil filler off. It still stinks. My goodness, just once I'd like to do this with grace. No washers on the generator stand. I do not approve of that. No washer here either. This is a 009. Wow, both the pulley and the flywheel were really nice to us in coming off that crank. I hope there's not a bad reason for that. Look at that, even the Woodruff key. I feel some rough stuff in there, lots of sludge. We're gonna take a closer look at this. Ooh. A couple of big pieces there. Lots of metal bits in there. So what is it inside an engine that looks like this? I don't think we're going to find much good news inside. We know we have a pulled stud here. I'm going to go ahead and torque the rest of these to see if anything else pulls out. Now would be the time to learn that. So that one was loose, but it didn't pull. I got it to 25. That one's fine. That one's fine. This one is loose. This one is loose. Ooh, way loose. These are not good signs. Way loose. Okay, nothing else pulled. That's good. Stud's coming out on this one. This one as well. Here we go. Oh, coming off nice and easy. No immediate sign of cracks. Lots of carbon in here. Not a serious step here where the cylinders pound a groove into the top of the head there. Despite the fact that the heads were a little loose, it's not too bad. And no stripped spark plug holes. I like that. The tip of this valve is a little bit dished. In a rebuild, it's more likely that exhaust valves would be replaced, so these may be original valves and these may be replacements. Yeah, look at that. There's the VW symbol on those intake valves, so likely these are originals from a gazillion years ago. Number 2 has a whole lot more scuffing than the number 1. That's interesting to me. A little bit of drama here. This is some aluminum from the side of the piston here. So here's the source of some of our shrapnel that was in the oil. We're going to probably see a lot of damage from that end play. All that damage has raised a burr, and I can't get the piston pin out. By default, I tend to favor gentle methods, even if what I'm disassembling is junk. This is probably one of the first VW tools I ever made for myself. This will give you kind of an idea of what goes on inside an engine with a lot of end play. The rods are pushed sideways because the pistons and cylinders aren't moving with the crank. Seems like that'd be really bad for the rods and bearings. That's curious. That's where some of our drama came from. These pistons are different This came from number 1, this came from number 2, but you can see the skirts are different thicknesses. There's different details in the castings. This one has different markings in it. And then over here I see some abbreviations. INDBRAS, I guess Brazil. I do believe they're the same size, but they'd have to be different weights. Maybe grossly different weights. Yes, those are a bunch of cases back there. Yes, some of them can be made into good engines. So we'll get there. This is kind of a for funsies project here, just to see if we can do it. And if we can, it's no big deal. Way loose. 25. Whoa. Totally loose. 25. Good. Whoa, way loose. These cylinder heads were barely on there. Ow. Retorque your heads, folks. Poor thing is seriously scored. I can feel all of those stripes there. This was garbage in there floating around in the engine. Same thing on this one. See, this plate has been used a few times. To me, these swirl marks here represent a loss of pressure. We'll flat this if we ever use it. We're ready to split the case, and I think this is about to get ugly. I'm gonna flip it on its side here. Found another really bad symptom. It goes sideways. That's about 15 thousandths of movement there. Take this opportunity to make sure that I have the oil plate off. Oil pump is out. Okay, all we have are the case fasteners and then of course the main studs themselves. Let's go. This engine has been an interesting teardown, even with all the unfortunate disappointments with it. We've got 3 different kinds of pistons. I really don't know how many different kinds of cylinders we have. At this point, I can't assume that pistons and cylinders, even though they're from different sets and different manufacturers, aren't mixed up themselves. It could have been random pistons with random cylinders for all I know. It'll be interesting to see the inside of the case where we see this JB weld, figure out what's going on there. I'm gonna see what this was torqued to. I found a lot of loose stuff on this engine. That was way loose. That was down around 15. This isn't tight at all. No wonder the engine's got problems. It wasn't bolted together. Not gonna get much bearing crush. Can you imagine if someone forgot to torque the main studs? Crazy. Well, for starters, I was expecting a lot more drama on the lifters. I was expecting to see something dished. And with all that metal that we found, I was expecting these lifter bores would be clickety-clackety, but they are not these anyway. We'll check the other side too. This is also promising. We don't see a big oversize here on this flange, and it doesn't look like it started that way. There's where some of our metal came from. The bearings took the brunt of it. That'd be great. See some material packed back into the bearing here in this oil channel. Cam bearings don't look brutalized. Of course, they weren't suffering from that in-play issue. That's good. The number 4 down here, not terrible. Number 3, little bit of a ridge. Number 2, a very pronounced ridge, and the dowel pin hole is a little bit wallowed out. Down here, on number one, absolute drama. So not only do we see that big oil channel pushed into the case, it's skinny because the sides of it that were forming that were scooting back and forth and pounding more of it into place. So we may be in trouble there, but the big question mark was the thrust surface. Is there enough meat on the bone? Stock is 0.868, 0.869, depending on who you ask. And this is all the way down at 0.810. That actually leaves us some room to do a thrust cut, maybe even a little cleanup cut on the back side. And if we can find the right bearing that has a 2mm oversized or 80 thousandths oversized flange on it, we might be okay. A new concern though is, does the number 2 main bearing web actually clamp? It may be opened up. So we'll get everything cleaned up, and that'll be one of the last tests before we make a decision on what to do next. Here's that area where we see JB Weld on the outside of the case. It may be hard to see on camera, but there's a pretty good dink here. It's a pretty good depression. They may have lost a rod at one point. That looks like it lines up with number 1 there. I see some drama in here, and that might have been their repair. They may have saved the case after a catastrophic failure. I don't see any drama with the cam. We can check the lobes for wear. It's an original VW cam with flat gear on it. It's a -1, so a little bit undersized. That has to do with the pitch of the teeth due to differences in the center line of the cam versus the center line of the crank. Those things move around from one casting to the next and one line bore to the next. I'm going to put it back in here. I'm not going to pay attention to the marks this time, but I'm just going to put it back in here and we'll see. That's actually not bad. Just a slight. I mean, it doesn't really mean anything because the crank center line is kind of a mess right now. But it doesn't go clunk clunk, just a tap tap. So it's not loose and it's not jammed in there where it would wear teeth. We're finally seeing some things that are encouraging, you know, here in a war zone and all. The dowel pin is not snug, but it's not wallowed out. You can see just a little bit of raised metal around the bore. Look at that bearing. It was just melting. It was just pushing metal around the outside of it. It was getting all packed up in here in the oil channel. That's some chaos. Let's take some measurements and see what we're dealing with in terms of sizing here. This has not been bored yet. It sure needs it now, but we have some meat on the bone here, folks. Our next goal is to make sure that when we clamp the case together and torque it down, that the number 2 main bearing saddles are squeezed together and there's no gap in between. So we're getting things all cleaned up, at least well enough to be able to do that check, and then we'll know how to move forward. Lots of work to do on this case half if it's going to have any kind of a chance. We'll be pulling all of the plugs for the oil galleys and tapping them for pipe plugs. Found a little bit more drama inside the case that may have come from a possible rod failure previously in this engine's life. There's some dings here around this lifter bore on the number 2 cylinder intake there. Little bit of bruising up here. That's not too bad, but the really bad part is over here between number 3 and number 4 on the top of the number 2 main bearing web. There's a lot that's actually just taken out right there, and to an extent it goes all the way through. This really would be all filled in, and there was a rib right here, so big chunk of the case taken out. But that's bad. That's like real bad. We have a problem, and it's right down in here. Let me show you. The top doesn't look too bad, but the bottom, we're in trouble. See all that light coming through? Yeah, that's not what we want to see. That means that the bearing saddles are not held completely together right there around the bearing, which will give us an internal oil leak. Oil that's going around the outside of the bearing in the channel will have an opportunity to make its way out here. So we'll lose pressure. I put a feeler gauge down in there and it was 7/1000ths of an inch, which is a lot. That is a Grand Canyon of oil leaks. I did find some folks talking like a 3,000ths gap may kind of sort of get you by, but we're twice that, and that's probably a questionable assessment anyway. So this thing is junk. I mean, we knew that when we first saw the #1 main bearing doing this. Between that issue with the case, not knowing if a line bore is going to clean it up at all, the drama from an apparent rod failure on the top of the case, and taking big chunks over in this area out of the case on the #2 main bearing web, this case is toast. Let's just have some fun. Let me show you some of the drama that we're finding on the crankshaft. You'll recall this thing was moving this way by 1.5 millimeters, about 65,000ths of an inch more specifically. And this is some of the shrapnel that came out of the oil. Well, here is our #2 rod bearing, and we see where a lot of that drama came from. So this thing was just delaminating and slapping around in there. I'm surprised that the journal doesn't look worse than it does. I actually don't catch a fingernail on anything here. I can see that it needs a polish, and when I measure it out, it's actually only 5/10,000ths under the minimum spec, so it's not that far out of spec as is. Trying to DIY polish it will pull it even further out of spec, but I'm kind of surprised that this crank is not in any worse shape after looking at the bearing that has been slamming against the poor thing. #2 main doesn't look horrible despite all the drama that was going on. Let's go ahead and pull these 2 rods off and see what we're dealing with there. It's also interesting to see the difference in the color of these rods. You see the ones here on, what would that be, #1 and 3 aren't as dark as the ones on 2 and 4. We think we see pretty clear evidence of this rod letting loose, so this must have been the crankshaft that was being used when that occurred. These 2 rods were on the crank when that happened, and these 2 rods might have been replaced. A weight measurement of these rods versus those rods would be kind of interesting. They may be way off if they didn't do anything to match the new rods to the old rods. Judging from everything else, I'm kind of guessing they didn't. But all right, let's take this one off and see what it looks like. Whoa, we haven't even pulled the bearing shells off, and we can see there's copper that is escaping over here. It was just getting squeezed out and just beginning to tear. See a pretty big pit right there. Yeah, it was just getting smushed. It was just getting spread out outside the bearing itself. This side not as bad. The rod journal doesn't feel bad. Let's do a quick measurement here. 2.1643. Which is just 1/10,000th of an inch below the bottom of the spec. That's kind of impressive. This crank might have been in decent shape before everything let loose. Hey, that doesn't look horrible awful. Haven't said that very often in this phase of the project. Yeah, that doesn't look horrible awful either. The rods down on this end of the crankshaft took the brunt of it, even though the rods on this end were moving back and forth the most. All right, we saw the most bearing damage on #1 and the least bearing damage all the way down here on #4. So the crank was doing that kind of a thing as it moved back and forth. The whole thing was going like this. So perhaps these rods, these darker ones up here, were just thrown back in there with some wear on them. And these replacement rods after the engine through a rod started off in better shape. So we're not seeing as much drama on these rods. I don't know, just a theory. This journal looks better than the rest of the rod journals and the #2 main. Let's see how it measures out. Yeah, it's the biggest one by a few tenths. So this is about 2.1647. So this one's actually inside the spec. The number 1 main, it feels a little looser. Let's see, just by a couple of tenths maybe. Yeah, that's right at 5 tenths. So 2.1645. Of course, on this micrometer, I'm just estimating the tenths. I'm doing what I can. I'm going to try and do what makes sense other than quit. I'm not going to put high value parts in this engine. No way, not with drama like that. Okay folks, this basically just became an engine blow contest. So place your bets. You'll see how it's built. Hopefully you'll hear how it runs, and then you can guess how many miles it'll go.
Subscribe now and check out the next video to see if there's enough left on this case for a line bore and a thrust cut. We'll see you in the next video.